Drums. At first glance, drums are a pretty simple and harmless instrument, so something like the Drums of Liberation may seem like a completely new element that's just been added to the story recently. But what if I told you that is not the case? What if I told you that drums have always been there across the entire series from the very beginning and are one of the most important hidden elements in One Piece? Let's explain why. So in a recent chapter of One Piece, we got a massive, big, mega reveal that Luffy is Joy Boy. I mean, obviously, it's kinda something we were all already expecting. I could talk about what it really means to become the new Joy Boy, or how the sound effect for laughing and smiling in Japanese is Nika, which connects to the sun god Nika with the idea of laughing, and the One Piece itself, but all those are things I've already talked about in depth in the past, so I think it's a bit redundant to dwell on that much here. Instead, what I'm much more interested to help explain is the concept of the Drums of Liberation that are mentioned within this chapter. Because they may seem like a little detail by comparison to the Joy Boy reveal, but that's exactly what Oda loves to do so much. Oda absolutely loves to drop a massive detail in what seems like an otherwise unimportant scenario, shadowed by a much more important reveal. Take chapter 850 for example, where Pedro explains to us for the first time the dawn of the world. This is a massively important element for the story, one that will no doubt reverberate across the rest of the story until the ending of One Piece, and yet it's dropped so nonchalantly during a minor battle that isn't even the focus of the chapter, with the reveal of Evil Pudding instead taking away the attention of readers. Or hell, even Joy Boy's own very existence was done rather nonchalantly as well, because Robin just randomly mentioned his name for the first time in a single-page scene in an otherwise completely unrelated chapter, with most readers never expecting by then that Joy Boy would become such a monumental figure, not to mention the very man that left behind the One Piece. This is a clever technique used to misdirect our attention and make it seem like a detail isn't as vital to the story as it may first seem, only for it to stick at the back of our minds so that Oda can then bring it up later again and again until we begin to realize how important said element is. So make no mistake, the Drums of Liberation are a very important element that will play a big role later in the story, but in fact, there's no better evidence of this technique that Oda uses than the fact that you have already heard about the Drums of Liberation. You just probably forgot it and put it in the back of your mind because it didn't seem relevant at the time, but believe me, you have heard of them. But then, where in the series were the Drums of Liberation mentioned? Is there any part of the story that can actually explain what they are? Well, you see, in cases like these, when I want to understand a mystery in the story of One Piece, I always try to consult it in one specific place: in the written history of the Void Century. Or in other simpler words, the laugh tale that Roger heard on the final island that details the story of the Void Century, just as Odin described it. That being, of course, Bing Sasaki. I've already gone in extremely deep length about how important Bing Sasaki is to explaining the entirety of the Void Century, but I've already made a video where I decipher and explain the lyrics of the song and what each of them mean, so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but to us right now there's one particular verse that interests us, and I'm just going to let a clip from that video explain exactly what it is that I mean. But at the same time, the song says to sound the drums. At first, one might make the mistake to think that drums indicate the arrival of war. But much like we saw in Skypiea, drums can also herald the arrival of a party. The party that would come after the storm. After all, there's no way tomorrow's morning sun won't rise, as the dawn of the world will certainly come. The fact alone that drums are mentioned in the story of Bing Sasaki is massive, considering that all the lyrics of this song refer to massively important secrets of the Void Century that have been passed down across the ages in this song. And once again, this laugh tale pretty much illustrates us what the drums of liberation really are. They are the drums that herald a party. These drums bring freedom to people because they help bring and connect them through parties, much like the One Piece itself. They encompass the idea of a party and the freedom, the liberation that it brings to people. And this makes sense because we saw that at the Flower Capital that they are currently playing drums, as indicated by the sound effect dong, the Japanese sound effect for the sound of drums, much like those we saw played in, for example, the part at Skypiea. This is particularly important because Bing Sasaki mentions to sing with one don. Don, once again, being the sound of a drum. So in that regard, the drums being played at the Flower Capital herald the arrival of a party, the only time of the year when the people of the Wano country are allowed to party together, and the only time of the year when they're allowed to drink sake, the only time when they are allowed to be free. This actually makes a lot of sense, because something you might have heard about before is that Joy Boy is in part believed to be inspired by the mythical Haitian deity of the same name, a deity that is said to bring people together through large parties through the beat of a drum. And so in that regard, I've always believed that Joy Boy's identity is tied to this idea of the drum, for the drum is what heralds the arrival of a party and what heralds the arrival of Joy Boy. And so it makes sense that the sun god Nika, who I firmly believe to be a former depiction of Joy Boy, is always depicted with two drums at his hips, just like the representations of the deity Joy Boy, god of the drum. That in particular makes everything fit together, because Husu mentioned that Nika was a warrior that would deliver people from suffering and bring liberation through the act of laughter. So in that regard, Joy Boy's drums of liberation would bring joy and laughter to all around him, heralding the arrival of a future party. But so in that regard, what if beyond the drums being played at the Flower Capital, there was the ringing of one drum that heralded the arrival of Joy Boy? What if the drum, in a sense, was Luffy himself? Kaido striking him down with a stick, just like one would do so with a drum, letting out a loud dong, the sound effect that drums make, as we can see drawn on the edges of the page, indicates he is beating Luffy almost like a drum. And so at that point, Luffy becomes like a drum himself, pulsating afterwards to the beat of a drum. And that is what makes Luffy like Joy Boy, the god of the drum, becoming the drum of liberation himself. And that, in particular, is exactly how the concept of drums has been hidden across the entire story of One Piece. Because every single chapter, since the very beginning, has always had them hidden under our eyes as dong. Does this sound effect sound familiar? It should, because it plays across the entirety of the series, anytime there is an important thing to be shown. And as Oda explained himself, this is meant to sound like drums, much like those that are often used in Japanese kabuki theater for dramatic effect. Playing across the entire series again and again, thousands of times, the sound of the drums of liberation has always been there. Ever since chapter 1. Where on the front cover of the first chapter and the cover of the first volume, we see it written right under our eyes: Roman's Dawn, the dawn of the world that will one day change the world of One Piece forever. Once Joy Boy finally returns, and when will bring a massive party that will connect the entire world together by delivering the One Piece. But dawn is simply read that way in English as dawn with a capital D letter. but when you write it with Japanese characters, it becomes don, the sound of a drum.